Minutes past the 8 o'clock hour, and Chris Lenois back with you on the Green Mountain Mornings program. And joining us for the remainder of today's program is Mike Faher. He is a staff reporter for VTDigger, as well as the Brattleboro Reformer and the Commons. Good to see you, Mike.
Good to be here.
You sure?
I had to think
hesitated
about it for
a minute. You're like,
then I thought, well, it's good to be here.
Come on, man. I'm nice. I'm harmless. I'm not somebody who's been out there at public service board hearings yelling at reporters and everybody about VY, although that didn't really happen. That's where we wanted to start this morning, was get your take on the Public Service Board hearing, which was about a week and a half ago now, I want to say, with regards to the timing of it from when we're having this conversation, but story in last week's edition of the Commons, as well as last Monday's edition of the Brattleboro Reformer. And we did get Randy Holhut's take on it. He was there shooting photos for the Commons, so we talked to him the day after it happened. So we got some kind of first blush impressions, but wanted to ask you, first of all, just so I'm clear on this, Scott State, who is the CEO for North Star, which is the main group that is heading up this cleanup if they purchase the plant from Vermont Yankee, and that's all dependent on this Public Service Board approval. Was this his first time in front of people who are just opponents to nuclear energy, period, when you're talking about groups like the Safe and Green folks there, Leslie Sullivan Sachs, or the Citizens Awareness Network, and Deb Katz, some of the people who came to this Public Service Board hearing? Was this the first time Scott State was face-to-face with them?
Well, he did appear at a VNDCAP meeting in Brattleboro back in December, and usually at those meetings, I can't recall, but there are at least a few folks who are nuclear power opponents. I don't recall it being quite as confrontational or as pointed, the questions that he saw at that December meeting as they were at the recent hearing in Vernon. Definitely, he and Mike Toomey from Entergy, they had to take some tough questions.
Now, is that maybe part of that is the format? Part of that, the audience with the state being there in a more formal, it's the state, the Public Service Department, the Department of Public Safety. I had that right? Public Service Department, yeah. and Public Service Board being there, and they're the ones who are officially calling the hearing. Does that sort of ratchet up some of the contentiousness among some people who are skeptical?
Well, I thought what was interesting was, the Public Service Board had this formal hearing, and that's them sitting at a table and listening to people testify. But prior to that, Mike Toomey from Entergy and, as you say, Scott State from North Star sat there for an hour by themselves. Now, these guys are well-paid executives, so I don't want to give them, this is what they do for a living.
Right.
But to their credit, they sat there for an hour, made a brief presentation, but then just took random questions from the audience for the better part of that hour, and took a lot of heat. But they're not legally obligated to do that, so I think that they deserve some credit for facing the public that way.
Well, and certainly it feels like this is about building trust. There's skepticism about nuclear energy in this community. There's skepticism about Entergy as a partner in this, and it almost feels like it's you had the bad relationship that you've been part of, and show me that you're going to be better than that bad boyfriend or girlfriend that you had before. Reading your recounting of it, it really kind of felt like that's what Scott State was setting out to do, or at least the hill he had to climb.
Yeah, there's a mix, and I don't have the history that some reporters do. I haven't been covering this for 30 years. It's only been a few years, but I feel like there's a mix of folks sort of falling back into old roles of anti and pro nuclear, but also I do think there's an open-mindedness toward North Star that we do want to see this site cleaned up, and if you can do it, that's awesome. But and rightfully so, that's tempered with skepticism. I think Leslie Sullivan Sachs from the Safe and Green folks sort of exemplified that when she got up and said, I'm just agnostic. Like, I want to see this cleaned up, but
right.
we can't be a guinea pig.
Well, and to that quote that you had in your story about her saying, I'm worried about Vermont being a guinea pig, anybody who they would be doing this on, or anybody who would be doing a cleanup period, to me, it would be a guinea pig, right? I mean, there's no blueprint. There's no model for cleaning up a nuclear reactor right now. So it's got to start somewhere.
It really occurred to me that night, and this is not to say the Public Service Board, the NRC, hopefully they're going to do everything they can to figure out whether this is a good plan, right? But it occurred to me that night that if this goes through, there's a certain element of faith here that's going to have to be.
Has to be.
There cannot be, there won't be any 100% guarantees that North Star is going to do this and do it right. If we're going to let them do it, we're just going to have to see. And it is a scary thing when you're talking about, nuclear waste.
There's no reason, and Deb Katz getting up and talking about concerns about that dirty cleanup, cutting corners, and North Star saying, if we run out of money, we're on the hook for that. They think they have enough money, and you go through some of the math about what they have in the decommissioning fund and what they think they can do. But just like the agreements that were drawn up with Entergy or with the previous owners of the nuclear power plant, the state doesn't seem to me like they're going to be abdicating their role as far as holding the feet to the fire for North Star and their partners. Is that ultimately their role in these public hearings, is to hear some of those concerns from these groups and then write those into whatever agreement if they do approve the sale? Is that the process here?
Well, one of the things I think we have to remember from the state standpoint is they can't regulate radiological issues.
True.
What they can do, and what may end up being the biggest sticking point in all of this, is site restoration standards. To what level is that site restored when North Star finally says we're done? And the big issue there is that North Star is sticking to its guns in saying they want to reuse some of the concrete from the plant as rubble, as fill on that site. And the state, up to this point, has been very skeptical of allowing them to do that.
Right. So does use of the fund come under the federal purview, or can the state control that to a certain level? Yeah. Again, to Deb Katz's point about putting the taxpayers on the hook for this if they say, oh, well, we're out of money now and we're just going to walk away from this.
Ultimately, again, it's the NRC that regulates the use of the Decommissioning Trust Fund. The state has tried to step in numerous times on that to varying degrees of success, mostly without success, quite honestly. But the big question, and you got to it there in your question, in your previous question, is if this all goes wrong, if everything goes wrong, who does this fall on?
Yeah.
And that question came up again and again and again at the hearing.
And that's where it comes to trust,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We're not going to do this to you again, baby.
Yeah,
that's
right. Right.
Now, you have a follow-up story in today's paper about one of the partners of North Star in this actually trying to respond to some of those questions. Would you consider this almost a point-by-point addressing of some of the things that were raised at the public hearing?
Yeah, this is Areva, the French company that North Star has pointed to as saying, we don't have a lot of nuclear decommissioning experience, but Areva does. They take apart reactors. It's what they do. So they've responded now with a new web page and a frequently asked question section that was designed, as you say, after the public hearing to try to address some of these issues.
All right, so that story is in today's edition of The Reformer, as well as on VTDigger.org. No doubt will be part of the Commons, too, because Mike's stories appear in all three of those publications each and every day and week. And fortunately, he appears with us here on the Green Mountain Mornings program every other week. We'll continue talking with him about other stories he's covered after the bottom of the hour news break. 44 degrees outside at 20 minutes before the 9 o'clock hour. Green Mountain Mornings continuing now. Your host, Chris Lenois, visiting with Mike Faher, staff reporter for VTDigger. Stories also appear on The Reformer as well as The Commons. All the papers benefiting from the reporting that Mike does here locally, and we appreciate him stopping by the studio to talk about those stories. Story from last Wednesday, where you reported on Brattleboro Memorial Hospital being cited for a couple of different violations around patient notification and then not following up on any sort of corrective actions to this issue. Before we get into the violation itself, stories like this, how do they come on your radar? I mean, this is actual, like, really nuts and bolts reporting to me that I think people don't really appreciate about the work that your industry does.
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw a comment on, I think it was on the VTDigger story, where somebody said, well, I don't understand why there was a press release about this. And I think people get the impression that we just sit around waiting for
Right.
waiting for press releases. But in this case, part of my job, a big part of my job, especially with VTDigger, is to go through public documents on a regular basis. And I would say at least half my stories come from public documents. And in this case, it's actually a pretty useful resource for anybody in the state. The State Division of Licensing and Protection maintains a pretty good website where they post these surveys, these inspections that they do about hospitals, nursing homes, that sort of thing. And you can find them. They're all publicly available. So that's how I found this.
Yeah, institutions like a hospital are going to put out stories about departmental changes, staff hirings, awards they receive, violations from the state. They're probably not going to be hurrying out there. And they're probably not required by law to put out a press release about this either.
No.
So you're going through the documents here, and you come across this violation, this fact that Brattleboro Memorial Hospital was cited. Well, the citation is in 2016, but it has to do with something that happened in 2014, right?
That's right. I mean, the patient, to sum it up, a patient came to their ER in March of 2014 with abdominal pain, was diagnosed with diverticulitis, but the radiologist at that time found a mass on the patient's kidney. Somehow that information didn't make it to the patient until fall of last year, 2.5 years later. And by that point, the patient's kidney was cancerous. The cancer had metastasized. And so that was the initial basis of the complaint to the state. The second part of that is that the state, I don't know when the state got their complaint, but they came in to BMH at the end of March and started talking to people about this mistake, this error. They call it an adverse event. And even at that point, 6 months later, after they'd realized that this major mistake had occurred, apparently, according to the state, some of the key people at BMH still didn't know that it had happened, and there hadn't been what they called a root cause analysis done to figure out why did this happen and how can we prevent it from happening again.
And then just so we're clear on timeline, when you said as of March, you're talking about last month?
Correct.
Right. So, I mean, this is something that we're talking 2 years after the fact and several months after the state had said, hey, got to do something about this, and the hospital still hadn't necessarily gone through the channels that they need to do to make it right on their end, to make sure something like this doesn't happen again. That, to me, obviously you never want a patient to fall through the cracks in this way, especially about something as serious as a radiology test showing a mass, but it might happen. There's all kinds of different factors, human factors that could lead into that. Not following up on it is the bigger sin to me. And it's surprising to me that the state did not do more with this violation, but accepted BMH's plan of action here. I mean, did that surprise you?
I mean, not necessarily. There are two reasons I say that. One is that, to be fair, apparently there was a in-house peer review that was initiated after this was discovered last September. The problem is, and the second aspect of this is, I don't know when the state got hold of this complaint. And what we do know is that they didn't come to BMH to start investigating until last month, which tells me that the state didn't know about it until maybe earlier this year, right? But even though there was that peer review happening, what the state says is that when they talked to the chief medical officer at BMH in March, the peer review still wasn't done.
Yeah.
So... again, going back to the original point, 6 months later, the hospital still hadn't figured out what happened here.
So, but okay, so to be clear, because I want to make sure I'm not putting out information that is incorrect, they did start on this plan of corrections before necessarily the state got involved. One of my questions out of this was, what would BMH have done if they hadn't gotten caught with this? But it sounds to me like they were already you said they were doing this peer review internally already.
My impression of it is they were doing this peer review, but what happened is the state came in and said, this isn't enough. You guys really need to take a closer look at this. And that is what led to as you say, the plan of corrections, the detailed, here's how we're going to change the way we do things. Now, it could be that BMH was going to get to that. It's just that the state said you're not getting to it fast enough. That's my impression.
Yeah. So the state is satisfied with that as far as this citation. They're not going to take any further action against Brattleboro Memorial Hospital. Is BMH susceptible to lawsuits from this patient?
I would
right?
I'm not an attorney, but I would certainly, I would certainly think so. And I should note too that the state told me that they will follow up with this plan of corrections to be sure that there's compliance.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to shift to another story that you wrote, and this one was appeared in Thursday's edition of the Brattleboro Reformer, because it's kind of a follow-up to the story you did around Leland and Gray, the middle and high school having radon detected there. That prompted some additional radiological or radon tests. So let's not confuse the two here. Radon tests in a couple of the elementary schools, Townshend and Brookline, elevated levels there as well. Talk a little about the whole process here.
Yeah, they found elevated radon levels, I think, in February, early March at Leland and Gray, and there was quite a kerfluffle over why we didn't act on this sooner, that sort of thing. But to the supervisory union's credit, they said, look, we're not gonna waste any time. We're gonna test all the other schools in Wyndham Central to see if there's any other issues. They did find issues, as you say, at Townshend Elementary and at Newbrook in Newfane. And I don't have the exact numbers, but they were both buildings showed levels of radon that are above the EPA's action level, the level where the federal government says you got to do something about this. And there's further testing scheduled for this week at both of those schools. Yeah,
4 picocuries per liter of air, I guess, is the threshold for an action level. Did you know what a picocurie was before this? This story?
It's interesting. The only time I'd heard that term before was in the context of VY.
I don't even know if I'm saying it right. Is it pico or pico?
I say pico. You say pico.
Let's call the whole thing off. Right on. Bottom line, though, no reason to think that this can't be handled in a safe and expedient manner.
It seems that way. I keep going back to, at the Leland and Gray meeting last month, there was a contractor there who deals with this on a regular basis, and he said, yes, these levels are above the EPA level. Yes, we need to do something about them, but we go into homes on a regular basis that are like 3 times this, the levels of radon. And apparently it's a pretty pervasive problem in Vermont. So I guess, we try to keep it in perspective that it's not uncommon.
And no reason to think that there's something happening geographically in that region where these elevated radon levels are being detected all of a sudden. I mean, when I bought a home here in Brattleboro, I said, you got to get a radon test. And there's a chance you have to do something to remediate it. Fortunately, we didn't. But this is and you go into some depth about this in your story, this is a statewide issue.
Yeah, I think the Department of Health stat is that there's something like 1 out of 8 Vermont homes is above the EPA's action level for radon. And I think that's something like twice the national average. I'm not a geologist, so I can't tell you why that is, but it's a big issue.
You're not a lawyer. You're not a geologist. You're being denial.
That's right.
You're a denier today of all these professions. You're an excellent reporter, though. Not a doctor either, indeed. And you're not a sheriff.
No.
Or a sheriff's deputy. But another story that you did that was in over the weekend edition of the Reformer had to do with the sheriff's department here in Wyndham County getting body cameras, but not as many as they wanted, apparently. They didn't have enough money for them, or they just weren't available? What happened there?
Well, I think it's a demand issue. Sheriff Keith Clark told me that there's such a demand for these body cameras now that they've got 30 of them ordered. They only got 15 so far, but they will get the other 15. But I think there's just some back order issues, some supply and demand going on.
Yeah.
These cameras are made by Taser, which everybody knows as the stun gun company. But apparently Taser, which is now called Axon,
right?
They've got a really big share of the body camera market, and it's a growing market. I think anyone who's read any news articles about police departments knows that this is a big issue.
Not until reading your story did I know Taser was a brand name.
Yeah,
I thought it was just what they called that instrument,
right.
Like Kleenex or Band-Aid or something like that. Who knew that Taser was a brand name for this? So the sheriff's department, they serve a number of different functions based on whatever they're contracted to do in towns or in the courts. Who's going to get these body cameras? How are they going to be utilized?
I know that we took a picture of one of their prisoner transport folks. They don't do the court security anymore. That's been privatized. But there's still sheriff's deputies that are transporting prisoners every day, usually from Southern State and Springfield down to Brattleboro for court. And those are still sheriff's deputies. I know that those folks have them. I believe that the folks who are out patrolling the municipalities have them. I believe the sheriff said somebody in Vernon has them, and they're going to deploy more as they get them. They've actually got two kinds. One are these sort of centrally mounted body cams on your chest. The others were kind of cool sounding that you could, they're flexible. You could mount them on a hat, on your collar, even on maybe a pair of sunglasses.
Okay. So some things to look forward to there as far as the Sheriff's Department and being more accountable in the work they do here in the community. And certainly appreciate you sharing these stories with us. What do you got in the hopper for this week?
Well, there's a meeting later this week. They're going to update us on the relicensing, the federal relicensing of some of the hydro dams in the area, Vernon and Bellows Falls specifically. So it'll be interesting to hear where they're at with that.
All right. Thanks for coming on this morning, Mike.
Thank you.
And you can see his stories at VTDigger.org as well as in the pages of the Brattleboro Former and the Commons. We will be back to wrap up this edition of Green Mountain Mornings after these messages.